I'm going to turn it on.
Thank you.
I might adjust yours a little bit.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay.
Okay.
That should be good. I'm going to go see if we have any other guests kind of rolling in.
Yeah, we'll get started shortly.
Yes.
Great.
Bring the students.
When were you here last?
Mm-hmm.
When was the last time you were here?
It was about 8 years ago, something like that. I think right after Obama. I think it was 09, as I remember. I think it was 09. Oh yes, this is what I had.
Good afternoon. Hello, everybody. I'm Jim Jonas. I'm going to be, if you weren't with us a couple weeks ago, I'm running the discussion group this semester here at the Dole Institute, focused on the rise of independence and the impact that independence could have on our politics this cycle and for cycles to come. I'm very happy to have with us today Pat Caddell, who has been a friend for a number of years and somebody that I've admired his political wisdom forever. I'll give you a little background on Pat Caddell. He's a political strategist, consultant, and Fox News contributor. He served as chief public opinion pollster and senior advisors for the campaigns of Democratic presidential candidates George McGovern, Jimmy Carter. Pat went on to serve as a personal advisor for President Carter from 77 to 81. He has advised over 150 political campaigns, including those of Gary Hart, Walter Mondale, Jerry Brown, Joe Biden, Edward Kennedy, Edmund Muskie, and Mario Cuomo. Pat has had extensive film and media experience as well. He served as a consultant on a number of major motion pictures such as Apocalypse Now, Reds, Air Force One, In the Line of Fire, and Breakout. In addition, Pat was a writer, producer, and consultant on the Emmy-winning NBC show The West Wing. He's appeared on all major news networks as a political expert and is currently a regular Fox News contributor and columnist for Breitbart. Pat Caddell graduated from Harvard and currently serves as the president of Caddell Associates. Everybody, Pat Caddell.
Thank you.
Pat, you clearly, by this resume, have been around the block a little bit with
I've
politics.
been there forever. I was in national politics when I was much too young.
Yeah,
I go back, way back,
well,
when I was 21.
You have a unique perspective on where we've been and what we've been through. Compare that historically to where we are with our national politics. Have you seen it in this level of dysfunction or disarray?
No, I mean, we're in a whole, we have been in this decade, I guess, in this century, we have been in the breakdown of the government's function, ability to function, and the highly partisanization of politics to a point where there's no such thing as bipartisan as a ridiculous idea. No, this is, we're going through a major upheaval in American politics. I'm working on my book now about it because I started a project. I've been polling off and on for fun or whatever, for serious business, and then when I had something interesting for many years. But I got out of that business, but went to Hollywood. I figured it would be much easier to write pretend stuff. People would like that better. And it was get everything done I ever wanted to say. And, but I had been back, and I sensed that something, I've been tracking alienation in this country since I was in high school, when I first started polling in Florida, and then into the nationally, McGovern, and then Carter, and whatever, and the early 90s, 92 when Perot emerged, which is a very important point we'll come back, talk about later, because it tells us a great deal, but no one in the media really, or politically, they all pretend it didn't happen, because it was a shocker. But but in 2013, after the 2012 election, when I'd written with Doug Schoen, and I wrote a piece in January that year saying that President Obama, the only way for him to get reelected, he had boxed himself in such, was to tear the country apart. And he was fully prepared to do that, and did. And the Romney campaign, the worst, as I've described it, during that year, the worst political campaign of a challenger who had a real chance to win in my lifetime, or in this last other century. But right after that, I began to get a sense that I had a good friend, Lee Hanley, who's sadly passed away, who was quite an interesting, he was very conservative, we were very different politically, but he was a real outsider, anti-establishment, kind of Republican, and I certainly was a Democrat, was anti-establishment my whole life, pretty much. And he said to me, I was talking about what I thought might be going on. So he said, well, I think you should go out and find out. You know, I'll put up the money for me to do it, and we did in 2013. And I was stunned. It wasn't a superficial poll like you see in the papers, or actually most campaigns now run. Polling has regressed in my lifetime. I hate to sound like a curmudgeon, but depth, I've always believed in depth, and I believe in not having surveys designed to tell you what you wanted to find out, which is what they are today, to fit certain narratives. So this was truly a great opportunity. It was a pure research. Go out and see. And I was blown away by the level of discontent, alienation, and pessimism in the country, which was so far beyond anything that I had seen after Watergate in Vietnam, which was what led to Jimmy Carter, or even in the 1990s. It was incredible. And I said, my God, we're on the verge of a revolution. I call it a pre-revolutionary moment. And then we've started seeing, it stopped being pre-revolutionary and began in 2016 to find itself. And we're still in this. Now, it's not understood by the media or the political world because they only know what they know. It's like, I'm very fond of Barbara Tuchman's book, The March of Folly, to show you the history, her supposition. I was on the West Point board at the time of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And, she delivered these lectures that led to the book, The March of Folly. And she said, what makes in the sphere of human activity, politics is clearly the stupidest and most ridiculously failing one. And she kind of wanted to explore it as a political scientist. And her theory was simple about Wooden-Hedden as she talked about it. But it really was a very powerful argument that people allowed their countries to get into disastrous things, or not just countries, but institutions. She studied the Catholic Church, and during the Reformation was one of her examples. The British losing the colonies, losing North America essentially, and how they proceeded to do that, and then American experience in Vietnam. And all of these were predicated, as she said later. It's kind of a book where, because of the lecture, you read the beginning and the end and skip the examples and you just basically got it. are really good, but the insight was powerful, which is the wooden-headedness she talked about, was the inability of people to admit they made mistakes, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, and with arguments not like in retrospect, oh, you should have, no, but they were there on the table, and why weren't they done? And she said, and the history of this is just universal, and so I think that that's what we're seeing now, and that is the political establishment, the elite establishment in this country has basically been repudiated, but human nature being what it is, they don't want to accept that they have basically suffered repudiation. And they want to go on as though it's normal, or get to normal as quickly as possible. And we're not going to, as I said, to quote H.R. Haldeman from Watergate days, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube after it's out. And that is what's happening. Now, how this moves, what I'm talking about is the discontent, which is directly responsible. You could see, and when I was doing these polling in 2013 and 14, every year, I also had invented this mythical candidate called Candidate Smith. And we tested how people reacted to a Candidate Smith. And it was overwhelming. I mean, the attributes of an anti-establishment, yet policy-oriented, kind of more centrist, center-right, whatever, if you want to do that, but highly anti-establishment was incredible. And the amount of, I mean, I invented that technique of testing projective people. I've never seen anything like it. From the beginning, Smith beat everything and everybody he or she would beat. First, just generically, could win as a Democrat, Republican, or an independent. And then later we would test them against real people. And that Smith candidacy slaughtered essentially the front runners at various times. But it was telling me that there was, and what is there, it's in the depth of the data, which I'll come back to and use as we go along, that this is a major historical moment. And I compared it from the beginning to like 1828, the Andrew Jackson, the revolution of 1824 and 28, which is the people deciding they were going to take their country back and they were going to run the democracy and not the elites. And so this has been, and I think is provable and at least arguable, but what astounds me even now is how little interest there is. And the consequences of this will be severe because, it's, as I said, it's not going to go away.
Well, can Donald Trump be somewhat explained with your Smith?
Yeah, well, in the sense that being the as I like to explain Trump, remember, this is a person who never ran for political office, never served as a high military, the only two places we have had presidents emerge from, experiences, high command or political careers, as governor or senators, or even, I don't think we've elected a House member president. Trump was the ultimate outsider. He took a conventional, ideologically wooden party and destroyed it in the primaries. It was him versus all of them, and everyone said, well, as soon as it gets narrowed down, first we were going to have Jeb Bush, remember him? The man with the money and all the endorsements, and I like to say if the Republicans had the rigged rules the Democrats had, he would have been there all the way through to the end, but he would have lost. But in this case, he went out quick because no one could compete with Trump's message that the country was screwed, that the people were being screwed, and that politics, special interests, all of that and he raised issues on trade. Now, Bernie Sanders started to raise these same issues on trade and so forth, and corruption, and special interests. I would say during the campaign, all during the campaign, that Trump and Sanders were supping out of the same trough at opposite ends. But there was a huge amount of crossover there in their themes, and they were both running against their establishments. The difference was that Bernie Sanders couldn't bring himself not to take a powder to take on the Democratic Party which, I mean, the machinery of it, which he was on the verge of being able to do, I believe. But in any event, Trump had, because of the rules, because the Republicans had never had an insurgency. I kept saying that from the beginning. They are vulnerable to being co-opted. So Trump gets nominated, and most of the Republican establishment, I think, probably voted against him, if you want to know the truth. And yet he won, and I believe, as I like to say, Trump didn't create this. What was there, he was the only vehicle available to the American people in the end who spoke to it. So therefore, as I was saying to you earlier, you know, you had a situation that's incredible in terms of the history of public opinion. Donald J. Trump on election day I'd seen this coming over the last week and weekend, and written a piece on Monday called, it was on Fox.com, it's still there, and it was called November Surprise, the Uprising of the American People. Because I was tracking, and have been tracking since September, people who were unfavorable or negative to both Clinton and Trump, which was a quarter or more of the public. I mean, that's a hell of a statement. And some of them were, you know, thinking of voting for various third-party candidates or whatever, but most of them were the choices were going to be obvious. And it was clear to me that if you looked at the attitudes of those people, that their problem was they thought, as did a majority of Americans on election day from the exit polls, that Donald Trump was unqualified to be president, and a bigger majority didn't have the temperament to be president, but that he would shake things up. One of the things that I discovered was a question that came up: if Hillary Clinton wins, do the people win, or does the political establishment and special interests win? And that was an overwhelming majority that the special interest and the establishment won, including a huge plurality of our own voters. And on Trump's side, it was the opposite. People said they would lose if he won. So those kinds of analysis, the deeper I got in, and in the exit polls that day, you know, Trump was winning. At 5 o'clock, when everyone assumed, the exit polls, which always have a huge Democratic bias, but it confirmed the narrative that the media and all the networks and everyone had, oh, well, she's got it, it's 6 points, could be bigger, it could be 10. Or no, it was those voters, I did get that question on the poll, the exit poll. We only have one exit poll. We used to have many, but in the effort to save money and consolidation, which is always, I think, bad, you have only one, and but that one showed, in the first numbers I saw at 5 o'clock, was that those people who were negative to both Clinton and Trump was carrying them by 18 points. And that was clear to me. That meant it was going to be really close. Couldn't tell yet how it would break, because it would be very close. But that this was a real horse race and not, you know, a coronation.
So in this anti-establishment time, we're seeing this mass movement away from the political parties where people are becoming independent. How come there's not been more success at the national level for independent candidates?
Well, I'll come back to that, but let's pick up the first supposition in your question, which I think is important, which is, let me just talk about 2016 for a second, about the environment. There were essentially three big, huge, overriding attitudes that I thought were framing the election. The first was something I've been tracking, which is a shorthand for the level of alienation, of discontent about corruption. I've been tracking the fact for several years that if you put lists of issues and had people rate them in intensity, as opposed to just open-ended, corruption in government and ethics in government was either number one or number two for most of the last 5 years. No, and by the way, that's an issue which is never spoken of, or as I like to say, in the excuse me, in the Harry Potter series is the word that may not be spoken. And that is the story. But it's keenly perceived that the system is rigged, number one, and against people. And that is across the board. Democrats, Republicans, all believe this in huge numbers. I mean, we're talking about numbers in the 80, 90 percentile of people saying that the system is rigged, that it's for the economic system works that way. We were tracking a question. Actually, I saw it in a poll a few years ago that the McClatchy papers had in the poll, which was about whether or not people believe the American idea, which is basically everybody plays by the same rules and everyone can get ahead, or is the system so rigged for those who are powerful and rich? And that's an 84-12 question, that it's rigged across the board. So that, but more importantly than anything, we were seeing as high as 70% of Americans, not just they were on the wrong track, no, that didn't, but 70% of Americans believe the country is in decline, straight out. 2/3 to 3/4 bounces. And I said, oh my God, this is much deeper than merely, oh, things aren't going well. Now, I just wanted to mention that because contrast that with the media narrative and the pundit narrative about the convention. Donald Trump gave a dark, evil speech. The world is coming, and Hillary Clinton said, oh, we're going to be better, whatever. Oh, we're going to love the optimism. Except that CNN took a key paragraph in each statement, each speech, in their poll, and ran it, and the Trump paragraph was beating her paragraph, wasn't identified as such, by 15 points or more. And it was, to me, but that would just prove the point. And the third big area was this, the belief that Americans believed that they were better, done better, that they were better off than their parents had been, and that, which is the tradition of the idea of being an American. Each generation leaves its children better off than it was, with greater freedom, greater opportunity. And a majority of people, including huge numbers, believing that their children would be worse off. In fact, one thing I found as we've moved out of 16 is that, there's about 40% of those who can say, who believe that, in fact, they're worse off and their children will be even more worse off. That is a dynamic that is dangerous. And I've always believed that we were at a turning point in this period with, as I said, with Smith and whatever, where everyone thinks the thing with Trump is, and there are many things to say, it's an interesting experiment, but as I said, it wasn't unexpected to some extent, but people wanted to overthrow things. And, I mean, they wanted to have somebody stand up for them. And we can discuss how well or not, but he clearly has taken on some of those issues, as he did with trade, as he did with immigration, issues that were not on the table because they weren't discussable. And in his own inimitable style, did it in a way that alienated a lot of people, but nonetheless got points across. So the reason we had a moment of the independent moment, and it was a precursor, and it was 1992, it's a quarter of a century ago. It's been that long since Ross Perot went on the Larry King show and said, finally, when asked about running for president, he had just resigned from GM. I had actually met with him on the 3rd of January. I flew to Dallas, and he met me in the airport, and little guy, and we went and had lunch. And I was arguing that I thought this moment had come. This had been right after we had a big scandal, bank scandal, in the House banking scandal, where politicians were were overdrawing their accounts but not being charged. Taxpayers were picking it up. And there was a lot of outrage about that and about pay raises and other things. Perot, and we had an economy that started slipping. Perot was announced, as he did on Larry King, oh no, I shouldn't do this, but we really need to look under the hood, and you American people, you own the country, whatever. Okay, and finally, he dropped the bomb at the end and said, well, because I had written him a memo saying how impossible it was almost to get on the ballot as a third-party candidate. So knowing Ross Perot, it was clear to me he never really wanted to be in that situation. He wanted to have a lot of attention, but in the end he didn't. So he set up this test. Well, if you people put me on the ballot, then I'll run and give you a first-class campaign. I'll pay for it and do it. And then went home to Dallas and sat there, and this breakout of, I talked to Bill Morris once about this thing about grassroots communication in the country. It's how jokes get from the West Coast, East Coast, or back and forth within hours. And even when they're not, no one will say them, like the famous Challenger jokes. I said Bud Light. I mean, that was all the kind of catharsis. But anyway, point was that what happened was he did the one thing that he had not anticipated, I had not anticipated. I suddenly realized I was cracking up because I realized what he had done. He was now empowering the American people to take back the government themselves, and they poured out and overran the system. So within a week he had, now there was almost no coverage of this appearance, little boxes like this in the business section of USA Today and the New York Times, the LA Times, and no television coverage. But within a week he had 2 million people who called his office to know how they could do this. So he put in these lines for people to call so they could coordinate with each other. And he didn't spend any money except on the telephone, and he only went out of Dallas twice. He would do interviews like on 60 Minutes, talking about how the politicians had messed up and how we had to do and whatever. And he just bolted in the polls. By June, the day of the California primary, in those days I had mentioned we still had multiple exit polls. And in all of them, when they asked, the California primary is a closed primary, it was in those days. You had to be a party registered Democrat or Republican to vote in it. Bush had secured the Republican nomination, basically. And that Clinton was finishing off Jerry Brown, even in Jerry Brown's own state. But when asked who they would vote for in November, now remember, these are partisans only. Perot was winning with Democrats to be first choice over Clinton, and he was winning with Republicans to be the first choice over Bush. And altogether at that point, because I put together the state polls, he was heading states with 430 some electoral votes. I mean, he was on his way to the White House before he pulled the plug on this. Said, wait a minute, this is getting out of hand. I really, and came up with the reasons, and later he would get back in the race only, well, I'll come to that in a second. But what happened was, in June, we had a revolution. The country for 200 years had built a political system guaranteed to make sure, on purpose, that no one could come from nowhere and seize power. Mm-hmm. And the American people were fully willing to jam Ross Perot down both parties and Washington's throats. And by the way, the level of discontent and alienation is nothing like it is today. It's kind of like earthquakes. They actually, as you go up, it's not just an additive, it's an exponential. So I would argue the same thing. And what happens is he came back, he got out, pissed off all the millions of people who said he had betrayed them, which he had. Because he really was in the thing to get rid of Bush. He had a personal animus to Bush and whatever. But anyway, John J. Hooker, who had been prominent in this effort to urge him to run, had called me and said, they did it. He said, he'll be back in before you know it. And his argument was he will not be able to stand the infamy and the vituperative reaction that it would cause. He was stunned that all these Perot people were calling him a traitor and whatever, because they had done their part now, he was not doing his part. So he gets back in the race, and then he spends some money, like on these half-hour shows, which actually had huge audiences, and, and it would end up with 19% of the vote, because in the first debate, I was watching this CBS tracking of the dial groups in infancy. But, and when Perot first opened his mouth, all the lines went straight down. And then you could see about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, it stopped. And then it started going, as he began to relay again the message that had drawn support from a large plurality of Americans to #1 in the polls. He was going to go up, and he won the debate. And then he was headed to a third of the vote, I thought, as much as 30%. In fact, I'll one more thing, stop. But he had, when he announced the people in black pajamas coming over the fences on 60 Minutes, 2 weeks before Election Day. Yeah. It's a long story behind this, which was always my belief that he would do anything to make sure he didn't win. Because he, at least in fairness to him, understood he shouldn't be president. He didn't really feel he should be president. But NBC, on their exit poll on the day of the election, 1992, remember, these are people who have just voted to elect Clinton over Bush, with Perot at 19%. And this is in the Roper Center, their archive. And they asked the question, if you thought Ross Perot had a chance today to be president, how would you have voted? And it was a third. And he was winning California and Texas, which were his biggest states by huge margins. So that was, but nobody, the whole thing with the establishment was, we've got to put this one away. And that's when the parties began to organize, rewriting the rules to make it even more difficult for this ever to happen, and really stepping on it. And the media as well, because it literally constituted a threat to an established order. Well, what we have not had in the past is, or even now, I mean, I believe that a serious third-party candidate, independent, in fact, I worked in some ways to try to find one and help do this, but running in 2016 could have been a serious candidate, might have been a Smith, Mr. or Ms. Smith, whichever, on their way to Washington, would have been a serious candidate. The problem is, with the structures the way they are, requires a large amount of money to get off the ground. Once you get off the ground, it's all whatever, it'll run itself. People will come out of the woodwork like they did with Sanders and, you know, the young people did with him, and be very powerful. But the problem is the donors, all of these nice, successful, rich people like in Silicon Valley, and all the ones who want good government and are bitching the most about parties and politics. None of them believe enough to actually do anything, to write a check. I mean, they're not serious. So what is latent now is this vacuum, which was huge in 2016, which I believe already is huge now. I have seen some polls where if you ask people, you know, running Trump against a Democrat, but add unnamed Democrat, but add on, there have been some public polls on this, but add on the option of another candidate. That other candidate's getting a quarter of the vote.
Some of that, though, is that structural piece that you talked about, the barriers that the parties have put up, the infrastructural barriers make it really difficult. And I understand, I've gone around asking some folks for raising money. They want to support third-party and independent candidates, but there's not that
They don't understand the business of revolution.
That's right.
Revolution is a commitment to do something, to make something happen. And everyone, they want to argue, it starts getting into these sort of, how many angels are the size of your pin or not, whatever. But the fact is there are those, but most of all what is missing is a message. It's not just an independent, I'm going to be, look, you have a major, most important independent candidacy in America right now, which is the one with Greg Orman for governor, because he almost ran and won the Senate race. He was I found he had already was being Smith. You remember that. I called up and I said, what the guy? I mean, all of a sudden I'm reading about this guy who's running against both parties and just rising in the polls in Kansas. And I said, oh my God, there's Smith. And went and talked, you know, and very favorably impressed. Now he got jammed in a two-party, we knew who's going to win the Senate thing. But the point was that there has to be, and he's written a book on this and done some things, and is the closest to having an ideology of what independency is about. And that is common sense. But I mean, you have to understand that the notion that, oh, we should get somebody and they should facilitate, Democrats and Republicans to come together is one of the most useless ideas I have heard. No facilitator is going to win. You better have an edge, and that edge starts with saying, this politics belongs to the American people, and these two parties have which they have. I call them the corrupt party and the stupid party. And it's easy, but there's a lot of each in both. I mean, you can see the Democrats with rigging the game for Hillary Clinton, which was outrageous, whatever, and the stupid party does what it does on certain things. And there's basically a donor-owned consultant party leadership, which Trump overthrew with no money and basically and yet then he's still a Republican. But in any event, the point is that there has not been a serious effort of resources matched to an understanding of what's available, what's possible, and the finding of this, as I keep saying, Mr. and Ms. Smith will arise if you open the door and you make a case. But somebody has got to lead it based on, as Perot did, a series of things that grab the attention. This is very much moving a bottom-down strategy.
So is there room in the next presidential or on the national scale in federal races for a sane Perot to emerge?
No, absolutely. I mean, look, I asked a question last year in the poll whether people thought the Democrat Party and the Republican represented what had a vision for America was positive. This is what I had. A question is for each of them. Was it in touch with the concerns of most people in America, out of touch with the concerns of most Americans? And wide majorities said both were out, including a substantial percentage of each of the people who claim to be Democrats and Republicans. What we have now, and this is what's making it even more accessible, the hyperpartisanship, which has now become even worse with with Trump, because there is a certain element of hysteria with him that has never stopped, started day one, and media and so forth, but which is trying to undo his election on the basis that no one who's an outsider is legitimate, in my opinion. I can argue this or not with people that want to ask questions about, but nonetheless, you have I would say about 18 to 20% of each party's partisans who view the other side as dangerous to their beliefs. And so we have all these partisan divisions, but they're really not. What I'm talking about on all of the big ideas and big questions and alienation stuff, the country's united. There's actually a huge common sense majority in this country. You just don't hear it because they're not allowed to be heard, because the parties have intensified their partisanship to the point that they are so angry and turning people off, as they should, because they are engaged in the worst kind of political survival power. The worse they get and the less ideas they have, the more greedy they get for consolidating and rigging and keeping their own power. And the idea that they put their power preserving it ahead of the interest of the American people, is only some 80% of Americans believe that across the board. So I mean, we need more attention to this. One of the things is, I put the data out, I put all the Smith data out, nobody paid attention to it, but a website up, and I would like to continue it. I think it's a very important idea. But I would like to see some coverage. The media is so made itself, is becoming so diminished in the eyes of the American people, and so, I believe, so dangerous to the democracy by becoming essentially partisan, so partisan that they're not protecting the American people. Their job is to protect. The reason we have a First Amendment was their job was to protect the people from power and not to get in bed with it. And that is all they're doing. And I don't care how partisan you are, it's just the stuff that comes out, it does. I went through the Journal this morning on the Plain Wall Street. I'm looking at the business section, and there are like 5 really important articles about on insurance rebates that people aren't getting, that insurance companies are giving to employers or whatever the cut. It should be a matter of discussion. There was an article about China. There's several starting on the front page about, oh no, an article about China about trying to do the 5G, where our communication people who are willing to just sit around and pick up their money, but who are not investing enough, and the Chinese are trying to take that next generation. And in fact, we stopped the CFIUS board on investments. The board that can decide, can veto these kinds of things, just did, because they're terrified that what's happening with the Chinese. I mean, the same with the Russians. I mean, the Chinese are everywhere doing everything, and we're just, you know, we're as lollygagged as we were 30 years ago. But there was that article. There was another one about how the big banks today got a 67-vote majority out of the Senate for them to be able, the big banks, to buy muni bonds and stuff, which there were elements opposing it. The one thing you can count on Democrats for, Democrats are progressive in the Senate, so right up to the point that it comes to contributions. And then you know, everyone's bought. And the country knows it. They're all for sale. I mean, both parties. And it is, I mean, there is no, the idea that they have principles anymore. Then the reason I say this, and this is important, because this is the opening for a real alternative force. Things like, I'm a great civil libertarian. I was the youngest person on Richard Nixon's enemies list when I was 22. And I really came to, from that moment on, really become very, and then having seen what power is like in the White House and stuff, become very, I'm a big fan of Lord Acton, whose great statement that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, but it's never one of the most important true statements. Power affects people in ways, and they do things. And but protecting the privacy and the rights of the American, and right now you watch what's happening. There's so much that has come out. The mainstream media, because it violates their narrative, that Trump is colluding. I mean, he had a campaign that couldn't even collude with itself. It was so bad. It's so disorganized. But and they're not really paying attention. There's a whole evidence that the FBI and other elements were, in fact, violating people's rights. We have a system of law in this country called the FISA courts, which are secret courts. The founders would be flipped out, because the notion that we have these secret courts that can decide to, without your knowing, and you have no rights to be represented, surveil you on whatever goes before a judge. And the judge, you know, 97% of the time since this has been constituted, agree to give wiretaps or whatever. The person being targeted doesn't know. Many times it's a foreigner who is an enemy of the country, and then they pick up Americans, and they've got this little trick they do. Let me just put it this way. There came out this report, it got almost no attention a year ago. In 2013, there were 10,000 Americans who were surveilled and run through all of the government's databases. In 2016, it was 30-some thousand. Now, if you think that the number of disloyal Americans tripled in 2 years, then you're really being foolish. I guarantee you that if anyone goes and ever blows that open, you'll find it was all political. Political people, whatever, that it was a surveillance. This is dangerous. And yet I watch liberals who act like, I mean, of all the things that I went through in my life, with the FBI scandals, and the CIA, and the church hearings and stuff, defending things that would appall them before, because they so hate Trump that they're going to defend what they have fought all their lives. They will abandon all of their principles. That's the truth with both parties. They will abandon all of their principles for power and for defeating the other. And the American people know it, and the first person who gets up and really explains to people how this is their country, not that they're the hero. Trump's a little bit on, I can do everything. No, the American people have to take their country back, and they have to take the government back, and it's not enough to elect an independent president. That's got to be the fountainhead for many candidates running everywhere. I said to Ross Perot that day I met him in Dallas, I said the real test of a candidate as an independent is not how well the presidential candidate does, but it will be measured in the fact that asleep tonight in America are hundreds of men and women who have no idea in 5 months or 4 months they're going to be running for political office, from Congress to legislature, whatever. You must be able to build a movement. The only people who can build a movement in this country that matters are the American people. They've changed the country. We changed the country over, women's rights. We changed over civil rights. Those were first movements in the country, and they were decided politically only after a consensus. Right now, the consensus ought to be, we should have an America. How about let's have a country again, and what that means. And if you don't like it, go off and support whatever you want to do. But I believe there's a vast majority of Americans who would respond to truth, which has been exiled from our politics. It's amazing. For some years, since I started this project, I've been asking a question about whether or not government lying, or political lying, has gotten so bad it has now become worse than ever, and in fact a threat to the very basis of democracy. Or the alternative statement that, look, stretching the truth and all of this has been going on since time immemorial, and it's just politics as usual, and it doesn't threaten a democracy. And it's 67 to 30 or 25. Consistently, people say, no, this is something especially dangerous.
Do you think the parties will get the message that they need to reform themselves, or do you think it's going to be a third party, a third force? Is it multiple parties? Where do you think this goes?
Well, it'll break down. The parties will not reform themselves. They are beyond reform. You saw that in 2016. See with the Democrats today, the Republicans and the cause of their donors, and I can give examples if people want to get into this, but I feel very strongly. They can't change because they do, just like in the March of Folly, they have no idea where they've gone off the rails, and they have no way of understanding how to reform themselves by throwing themselves out of power. You got to start with. So therefore, I think we will get alternate parties, or we will get somebody, somebody or a movement will take one of them over. That has been and throw everyone in power out.
Yeah.
But you know what? I mean, who wants to be a Democrat or Republican? I mean, really, in a marketing sense, in a world, brands matter. Anybody doing an analysis, say to both parties, first thing to do is get rid of who you are, change your brand name, do whatever, because you can't.
They're both broken.
They're both totally broken, and they're not going to fix themselves. That's a fantasy.
I read an article that quoted you as saying that the slogan "Make America Great Again" was the most effective presidential slogan you've heard.
In my lifetime, I think, by far, because look, you got to hand it to Trump. This guy has instincts, as I said. He may not be much of a strategic thinker, but he does have instincts and things. And that was his slogan. He came up with that idea. And it spoke to me about all of the feeling of decline, the feeling that the country wasn't working for me, whatever, all that captured in one slogan. And you raised this question with me. And in his best operative line of that, which he has not done as much as I would like to see, was drain the swamp. But you cannot drain the swamp unless you replace all these people. One of the things that's extraordinarily popular in this country right now is these people should go. The political class is made up of people who agree the way the system, the true failure of the system, is it recruits candidates who will adhere to the, quote, the given orthodoxy of truth, which is, and if you're not, then you're on danger list. Texas last night, they had their first primary in the country. And what I found amusing, there are like 4 Republican districts the Democrats targeting as possible pickups. In 3 of those contests, the candidate who raised the most money, in other words, had the most established support, didn't even make the runoff. They have a runoff in May, but you have to have 50%. So in 3 of them, the candidate with the most money and most support didn't even make the runoff. In the race that was most interesting, because it involved a woman who was being supported by the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the DCCC, who was attacking another progressive woman because they think she'd be a weaker general election, and they unloaded thousands of dollars attacking a Democrat. As you know, you can't vote for her. There were 4 candidates in the race. Their choice got 29. This person they were attacking got 26, I think, or 25, and the other 2 candidates got knocked out. But, and one of them had raised also the most money. I mean, what is this? I mean, the war internally, because other than deciding that Trump must go, or we should weaponize the Constitution and impeach him whether he's done anything or not, or he is just, beyond the pale and whatever. And most of all, the belief that the American people are too stupid to know what they're doing. There is from Washington and the political elites the basic subtext of everything they say. You are too stupid out here to understand what's good for your country and what is not good for your country, and too stupid to make the decisions. You should do what we tell you to do. And if you don't, well, you could watch election night. I mean, you just watch the commentators that were freaking out. Because in 2016, because how dare the American people not do what we told them to do? This is a real sickness going on. And it is, because they're all part and parcel of the same elite. They eat together, they sleep together, they marry together, whatever, and they all speak out to the country. They have no more understanding of what goes on outside the Beltway or the I-95 corridor to New York than the man in the moon.
Let's take some audience questions. Do people have some questions for Pat?
Yes, sir.
Let's wait for the microphone so we get that.
Okay.
I didn't quite understand your comments earlier about the disarray and discontent that existed throughout 2012.
I'm sorry, it existed when?
The disarray and discontent that existed throughout 2012.
2012?
Yeah.
I think I was seeing ripplings of it in 12. Didn't see it really, and it was after that I went and looked at it. But I had a sense. I really just felt something was not right. But I didn't know till I went out and looked, and boy did I get knocked on my butt. Right.
Well, could you then discuss the difference between 2012 and 2017?
Well, the difference is that we had a break, that what was a potential. See, an alienated, a disaffected and discontented public can also be very passive. In fact, it tends to work toward that. In fact, the major parties, what they most want people to do is not vote. What they want them to do is go to sleep. And the danger is if they get too rambunctious. So out of nowhere, what I said in 2013 is you could see what I call the pre-revolutionary moment, this rising up coming. But the question was, would it activate itself? And that's the big, was to me the big unknown. Or would it be what it often does, makes people disillusioned and disaffected and non-participatory. And in fact, what it did was that it erupted in certain ways. You could see it with Trump, you could see it with Bernie Sanders. It was very uncharted, but the bubble burst. The most important result of election night in 2016 and leading in 2017 was not even that Trump won. It was the American people discovered they could overthrow the system, that it was possible to take back the power that is genuinely their sovereignty. I would argue the real crisis in this country is the sovereignty of the people has been displaced by a political order which believes that its job is to administer the sovereignty, and it's up to go back and read Franklin Roosevelt's renomination speech in 1936 when he talks about when he lays this out about reaching for the people's power and the organized forces and whatever. And that has happened in our society before. And that's what part of the Revolution 1828 was, part of the revolt, the New Deal change. We have had these moments in American history. But this has been one that's languishing, the people feeling that they have no say. I mean, this is really dangerous because what it means is, I like to say, the issue with Trumpism, whether Trump succeeds or gets reelected, whatever, the question is, where does all this go? Sooner or later, if it fails in their minds, they will turn to more. I have news for I keep saying to people, we're not going back to normal. That's all the political, please, let's pretend it never happened, you get rid of him, you get rid of it, make him go away. I'm telling you, it's not going to happen. If anything, it will become the danger of not having an independent effort.
Yep.
Or someone who can take over fully one of the parties and displace the people there. With this, and I think that's very hard, the latter, and I'll speak to that. But is that you will end up with someone who will have what I call the man on the white horse syndrome. You have a crisis, and someone comes along and says, "Let me tell you, you really got to fix this."
Yeah.
And that and it becomes more radicalized, and the danger, as I used to say, is, in my lifetime, George Wallace was probably the most obvious demagogue, really. But the best is Huey Long. And I like to say, somebody with the power of Huey Long in the 30s, Franklin Roosevelt was terrified of. When people, and I actually have an original copy of him singing Every Man is a King. I have the actual recording. And Huey Long running on George Wallace's, by the way, a Ivy League educated person running on against the entire establishment and discrediting them, populist in the extreme, but running on, like I said, George Wallace's 3 campaign themes when he was 3 times he ran for president. Not a dime's worth of difference. Send them a message and stand up for America. And God knows that could be good or bad. And that's why I'm so concerned that it be a good movement. But you cannot continue to sustain. Look, when you have a question, which I've been asking, in fact, I encouraged Scott Rasmussen to use it years ago, the idea of when you ask people, explain the Declaration of Independence is based, its premise is based on that all government derives its legitimate powers from the consent of the governed. And I've been looking at this since 2011 or earlier. Do you believe that the government in Washington operates with the consent of the American people? And 68 to 75% of the people say no. If you realize that we had a revolution over that concept, this is very dangerous stuff.
And that's gone up?
No, it's stayed level for 4 or 5 years. It's what I call the easy way to understand this. When 3 out of, say, basically 7 out of 10 people you meet believe that the government doesn't operate with the consent of the governed, you have a brewing revolution. That's why I came to that original description, and therefore you get it. But I think that and the parties have real problems. I mean, but this is, one of the things that made me, I think, different, and why I had some success in the business as a self-taught kid pollster, was I was always intrigued with what people had to say. I was always shocked when I would learn, because it was always, but I really came to develop a great faith in the aggregate American people, in the aggregate. Even when they were breaking my heart politically, which they did on more than one occasion, because I believe they operated from a sense of trying to figure out what they were doing was right or wrong. And that was important. And, there's the corruption that is let loose in American politics, which money has done to both parties, and since 1980, and the unleashing of special interest money and power, is so dangerous. It's the one thing a democracy cannot sustain. It's so corrupting, and that's what these parties live on. You know, the reason we don't have reasonable immigration reform is very simple. Nobody who's in the establishment wants it because it's not in their interest. Democrats want cheap votes. They like to make everybody a citizen and get everybody. And the Republican donors, the donor class, wants cheap labor. And that's the reason that we've had nothing really, which should be an easy problem to have resolved some years ago. Doesn't get resolved. And we have this on thing after thing because, as I said, money drives this process. It is driving the consolidation in media because the FCC is now going through with some acts that are really terrible. It's happening with social media, which ought to be regulated. Anybody who believes that you should let Google and Facebook and whatever operate unregulated when they are virtual monopolies with more power than the robber barons could have ever believed to have over our free speech, over what constitutes news, whatever, without any regulatory thing. I'm sorry, that we've never done that. That's not, you know, somebody's supposed to protect the public interest. They're not going to do it. They're making money. They don't care what they do to children. I mean, they claim they do, but if you've seen some of the stories I have of some of the people who invented this, talking about, well, our model is to hook people and have them addicted and whatever, and now Google wants to do this with, Google has announced, or FaceTime, that they want to do this with children. This came out the other day, which was, you know, you got to ask who is taking care of the public business interest. And I could go through a dozen issues here. Food policy. You know, the country's become so much more aware, consumers, on food processing and concerns. Well, we have a farm bill today that will pass, it's up this month, has to be renewed, that is the biggest giveaway to special interest corporations, to things that are not healthy, to whatever. It's all bought and sold in both parties. And you can't, and somebody's got to get up and talk about that, because either the government belongs to the people or it belongs to who can buy it. Right now it's for sale, and any partisan who believes it is not is wrong.
Got another question here?
Several days after the election, I was at a meeting in Washington, D.C. and met Larry Sabato,
Yes.
the pollster from Virginia.
Yeah, the professor.
And he was beside himself because he had missed his projections by such a wide margin.
Yeah.
What happened with him, and what happened with a couple of the others that, you know,
The
missed by so
polling was
far?
so bad. Let me put the state polling particularly. And it was because it's done cheap and whatever, and it's also designed to support narratives, outcomes, you know, these. And also that's so, look, these newspapers and networks, they do not have outside people running it, which is what they should have. This has been a particular thorn to me for several decades, because it's wrong. You know, either you get people who know what they're doing, pay them to do it, but they want to do it cheap. They do these polls, they do so many of them, and they don't ask anything. When I'm talking about the Smith research, I'm talking about 150, 60 questions. You know, pushing the length as far as possible, doing several of them simultaneously to get enough depth. And they're talking about 2 minutes, you know, and who you're for and how you're going to vote and a couple things. And, you know, it's something I know a lot about, so I can pick and choose. But a lot of it was so bad. And by the way, guess who doesn't, you know, they don't stand up and say, we didn't know what we were doing before. And obviously we're wrong, so poor Larry. I mean, Larry said, and so did 538, and they're all looking at stuff. And it was clear that if you look deeper, something was developing. And in fact, I believe that the reason of the vote margin is because of this insane idea that we did another good reform proven bad, early voting. You know, the country's supposed to have an election day, or a day, I don't care, weekend, whatever you want. I don't care, it can be whatever. But the idea there should be a culmination with an election, not people voting a month before, before things are all developed because people change their minds or whatever. Their affected campaigns matter. Getting to a choice matters, and we have disrupted that process. And it is in the hands, I must tell you, you want to talk about stealing votes, folks. Early voting and helping people who are incapable of deciding for themselves how they're voting, whatever goes on in this country in ways that it should be an entire national scandal. And it's wrong. We should have elections that matter and culminate. And I'm not saying, when we let anyone absentee ballot whenever the hell they feel like it. We haven't thought, because we think it's a good reform. But one thing you learn about reforms in politics is that they have unintended consequences, and most of those consequences are horrific, just like campaign finance proved.
However, Pat, you predicted Trump victory the day before.
I wrote a piece, actually over the weekend I saw this break, and so I raced Monday morning, had the editor at Fox.com, I was going to be at Fox, so I was supposed to be, but anyway, to run over, and I dictated Monday morning, late Monday morning, so it would be up Monday afternoon, the piece I'm talking about, which didn't predict us. It said, this is now happening, it's developing, and my question was whether there, how many votes had already been cast before this thing began to happen, kind of gelled together, and whether, we're in the bag, or in the bank, if you will, and that and a couple of other things. But, because really, this is crazy. There's Hillary Clinton spending $1 billion on a campaign. We'd already learned in the primaries that money was not working the way it should. And, but she was spending $1 billion and whatever they were doing, and had the media on her side and everything else. And there's Trump who didn't spend half of that, didn't even have half of that to spend or spend. And, you're running for president, you get big coverage, you don't need, but one thing we've proven is money. See, this is really going to be the death of one of the most corrosive elements of what we're talking about is consultants. I was a consultant, stuff I was in it before there was huge money. Now these people make so much, because it's like an arms race. The more they can convince the donors on both sides that another $100 million and whatever, which they can rake off. It's like the Russians and the U.S. was doing during the Cold War, freaking out each side about what the other side had or would have and whatever. The truth of the matter is that corruption is so elementary because it begins to affect who's allowed to run, who is supported. But what we know is it doesn't work. But it didn't stop anybody, this year or they're out going to do the same because they don't know any other way. Mm-hmm. They don't know any other way than to fill, if you live, I guess you're close enough to Missouri, you can get a state where it's considered a toss-up, a swing state, where every minute of your TV is spent during the fall on political commercials in which people are degraded, attacked, smeared, as though anybody believes in anymore. The marginal return, to use an economic term, is decreased to almost nothing, as was proven, and as I like to say, in an election with big message, which gets heard, big message will always win. Mm-hmm. This is the problem about 2012. Everybody, oh, well, God, it's just data stuff, we'll isolate the... No, that was an election without a message.
Yeah.
So once you have, techniques matter more. What they never substitute for big ideas.
Momentum and message.
Momentum and big themes. And you can create that, and that at the presidential level is why it happens. And the people, and here's the problem. So many of the people, just like on Wall Street, who got into political consulting as the money got bigger, have no clue about how to do a campaign. I went to Hollywood. I can tell you what goes into film work and television, and these people throw crap up on TV that they should be arrested for. It's not only you can't even. It's so bad. It just turns people off, sometimes by design, but it's not effective. And nobody gets up and says to people when they fail, "You failed. You got to go." No, this is it, and this is the other thing that happened. Politics. I used to like politics because it was a real win or lose or some game. Or some, if you did well, you won, you should go on. If you lost, you should get out, or whatever. No more. If you have enough media people, you feed. This is what the consultants do. They feed their people in the media inside information, which is a violation of their obligation of their candidate. Because the candidate may win or lose, but they must go on, and they need these media people to validate them, or people in Washington. That's why there are no secrets in campaigns, because people can't keep their mouth shut, because the consultants are out there selling, basically bartering that information for to pursue their own future career. Enough on that. It's just awful.
Any other? Okay. Let me just, you have one real quick?
Just one quick question. So you talked about your Smith survey and identifying the 3 factors that were really important.
The big ones, what I call
kind of
those
big
shaping the environment.
I was just wondering, particularly with Trump and also Perot, both being businessmen with no political background, but the fact that they were businessmen, do you see any frustration in the public not being able to get somebody in, or wanting somebody in there that can actually get something done because they've been in the real world?
Yeah, well, I think that people, the business thing, they're both models, and they were both celebrities, remember. Perot was a celebrity because he got his people out of Iran and quit the GM board and said that it took us only 4 years to win World War II, and it took GM 10 years to make a car, and how ridiculous this was. And it's plain spoken and whatever. Trump is a celebrity in his own, reality star. I don't think the business model is so important as in some ways you can argue that's enough. I think most people, if they had their druthers, would like to have someone who knows the system and experienced in it. But they'll take a total outsider if they have to, because they don't want to have another soiled person, another, a politician who's played these rules and accepted them. You can't do that. It doesn't work. Bernie Sanders, why was Bernie Sanders successful? Almost should have won the Democratic nomination, other than his letting Hillary off the hook when he could have finished her. But because he was a fringe person. I've known Bernie for years. In the Senate as a socialist and whatever, and never changed that. But he was authentic. That is not a word you would ever apply to Hillary Clinton or most anybody else being considered for president in his party, in that party. It was the authenticity that appealed to people, even people who totally disagreed with his positions. I mean, most of the country voters are not socialists, but, but there were a lot of things they agreed with, and they thought he was authentic, and authenticity and message, and there's a way to do this. But the real question is for someone, what I'm so frustrated about is the belief that in a full-throated and full way, in a thoughtful and intelligent, ideological way of ideology, non-ideology, is to give voice to what exists in the country, and most important, legitimacy of the American people's right to run their own, to control their own country. Because that is, democracy, and I've learned one thing and I believe from it, in the people's hands it possesses an irrepressible magic. It can do anything. And in false hands, it is dead. And unfortunately, that's what we're being given and told. That's what we must choose from. The first one says, no, why should you? It's like in Kansas. What's going on now? I read the Democrats. I read today. Sebelius was saying, oh, God, Orban is standing in the way of the Democrats winning. And the Republicans were saying, well, he's going to stand in the way of their way. And for Senate, and the answer is, what do you mean your right to win? I mean, who said you are the only people? I mean, and I'll tell you, I've seen numbers in this state that make my national numbers, I've been telling you some about, look like child's play about what they think in this state. And it is how outrageous. There's nothing in the Constitution that says only Democrats and Republicans and the ones we approve of Because, as I said, it was just what the DCCC is doing. Republicans do it all the time. Let's make sure that we get people who believe like we do, because those are obviously sane people. And anybody else who comes with another message is obviously insane and dangerous. And we must get them out, crush them, or get rid of them. Or we just don't support them. So that's affecting the recruitment of candidates and everything else. And that system has to be broken. Because I'll tell you, I don't believe in a country of 300 and some million people that there are not, somewhere out there, at least 50 people who are at least equal to our founders and to the people who shaped this, who don't even know. Because anyone who's sane and believes that would never get in this system. That's why I'm saying the independent route has got to open up, because then people will come, because otherwise you're going to get in the system where first thing they're going to do is go after your family, attack you, everyone, and he's, just trashing everything. And it's not worth it. And so we have suffered in this political society for what I call the missing generations. We've got 2 generations have passed where we have not had fresh blood because the system has become designed. There's a book by a gentleman who used to work for National Journal, wrote a book, Alan, oh God, I'm sorry, and he wrote a book in 1990 called The United States of Ambition. And his theory was, who sent these people? And he actually went out and studied a local government in South Carolina, where I'm from, a state government, and the federal government. And at the end of his book, his conclusion is, these people sent themselves. Who else would want to, what kind of ordinary person is willing to spend all of their time begging for money? What do they do in Congress? They spend almost most of the day on the phone begging for money. They go to these buildings, they have these call lists, and if you don't perform, out with you. And if you want to see, you should see the 60-minute piece with the former chairman of the Democratic House Committee, Israel, on Long Island, who tells the story about how awful this is. So you have to, then you have to degrade yourself by attacking or being attacked, willing to be smeared. What he pointed to is, it takes a particular kind of needy person who needs some kind of whatever, because people of character will take one look and say, if that's what I've got to do, hell with this. I'll tell you that, and I'll do this last thing. I have a thing when I'm doing big audience speeches and stuff, and it never fails to be the same. I ask people in the audience to think of it, close their eyes and think about if there was some major crisis in their world, who is the person they would have the most confidence in? It could be anybody, politics, doctors, the guy that runs the gas station, whatever. So I said, I want you all up front. Then I said, open your eyes. Now I want a show of hands. How many of you thought of your congressman? And the entire room breaks into spontaneous, hysterical laughter. And that tells you everything. The people you want are not there, and the citizens who ought to consider it won't, because how can they do this? So that is the most important reason for a new movement. Unless somebody can take one of these parties and throw the people in it out, which is no easy doing. Greg Orman wrote a piece in the summer of 2016, which was very important. And it was a piece which said that even if Trump won, he would fail because he would still have to be the head of the Republican Party. And there was no way they would let him be what he wanted to be. And we've seen a lot of that back and forth and whatever, and that's the same with the Democrats. I mean, the Republicans are, much more country club and much more, as I said, addicted to their donors and lobbyists like you wouldn't believe. And the Democrats are in identity politics. They lost any concept of us. It's all about you're a victim and you're a victim and you're this victim and whatever. And it gets old and it gets tiresome. But nobody on either side, as I said, speaks really for the common good. And it is not, common good is not taking those two extremes and adding them together and dividing by 2. That is not an answer. That is the worst of everything. So
Pat, we need to wrap up.
All
But
right.
Thank you very much,
All right.
Pat, for coming this week. Thank you. Appreciate it. Excellent, excellent discussion. Next Wednesday, Scott Morgan, who's here with us, will be my next guest, my next victim, here in the discussion group to talk about Party of the Center, and it's getting started here in Kansas. So thanks, everyone, for coming. Hope you can join us again next week.
Yes, yes, Aaron Aaronhold, thank you. Ambition, yes. It's a seminal book. It's a seminal book.